Side Lutchenko at center ice, cuts to the middle, across the blue line, now backpedaling, makes a move through the defense, drives all the way to the net, he scores! What a goal by Jet Lutchenko, a power play goal, a fantastic goal by the former London junior knight and first round pick in the priority selection last season.
Hey everybody, it's Isaiah. Just reminding you that FlyersNittyGritty.com and the O&B Puckcast are brought to you by Summit Public Adjusters. Hey, do you have damage to your home? Not sure who to call? We suggest that you call Summit Public Adjusters before your insurance company. Dealing with your insurance company can be very stressful. Let Summit take the stress out of the claims process. From storm damage to your roof, to toilet overflows, to broken pipes and fires, Summit gets you the most money for your repairs. So next time Mother Nature leaves you in need of repairs, call Summit Public Adjusters at 215-752-0560 or visit summitpublicadjusters.com. Licensed in PA and New Jersey.
And we are back. It is Isaiah. Welcome to the O&B Puckcast. It's a two-parter today. This is episode number 226, brought to you by FlyersNittyGritty.com and Jim Southstreet, along with some of the adjusters. We have panel with Dan and our special guest from the Athletic, Scott Wheeler. We wanted to get Scott's opinion on some of these prospects. I'm going to hand it over to Dan. Scott, thanks for taking the time out this morning.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys.
Guys, I'm super excited about this show because honestly, Scott is one of the best draft and prospect analysts out there. I mean, just for his work alone, plus Kevin Kurz, who follows the Flyers, it is worth the price of a subscription to the Athletic. So any Flyers fans out there who don't have an Athletic subscription, trust me, just for Scott's articles alone and Kevin's Flyers analysis, it's well worth it. Scott, really glad to have you on the show. I know it's probably been a whirlwind for you the last month. It seems like every day you're putting out articles. And so in terms of the Flyers draft, and obviously there were a lot of Flyers fans who were kind of shocked at what happened, who are still kind of trying to sort of, last year, everyone was so excited about the Michkov pick. This year, I think it was sort of like the opposite, where the Flyers fans were kind of looking at it. I think there had been rumblings they were trying to trade up for Ivan Demidov, which I think Danny Briere sort of confirmed. And then in my mind, the Flyers just sort of coveted London Knights players. I thought they were really hoping that either Sam Dickinson or Anton Silyev, who's kind of the Flyers defenseman, might drop to them. I was convinced one of those two guys was going to drop to them. Then San Jose, I thought they were going to take Zev Buyam. They take Sam Dickinson. And then the Flyers have a chance to draft Zev Buyam. They trade down and take Jet Lutchenko. So I guess first, go into a little bit sort of your thoughts on the Flyers draft and why you had it ranked that way for them.
Yeah, there are a few reasons. I think it starts with their first three picks. I didn't feel like they got full value out of their first three picks. Now, they picked three good players, so that's a complicated web to untangle. I really like Jet Lutchenko. Jet Lutchenko is an excellent athlete. He's a great skater. He's an extremely intelligent player. He's a strong kid. He's a centerman. There is a lot of appeal of a Jet Lutchenko. I know at least two other teams told me they were prepared to pick him shortly after the Flyers did. So it's not like the Flyers were on an island with that selection. He was going to go in the teens. So Yeah, I mean, it's tough to be too hard on a when you pick a good player. Where I'm at on that though is that Zeev Boyum and the availability of Zeev Boyum, I think there's a pronounced enough gap, and frankly, I don't even think it's close. I think there's a pronounced enough gap between who Zeev Boyum is as a player and what his ceiling is as a player, and I believe Zeev Boyum has a chance to be a star defenseman in the league, to be a first pairing defenseman in the league. The gap between that and Jet Luchenko's ceiling, which is probably a second line center, and more likely just a really solid middle six center, I felt that it was incumbent on them, the way that it played out, even if Zeev wasn't their guy, even if they didn't love him maybe like I did. I think there's enough of a gap that the trade back to slide back one pick and take Jet Luchenko just didn't feel to me like the right value play there. Now, I know they have Cam York. I know they just traded for Jamie Drysdale. Adding Zeev Boyum would be adding a third player who's about 6 feet tall and plays the game with an offensive tilt. I believe, though, that Zeev Boyum has a much higher offensive upside than both Jamie Drysdale and Cam York, and that we're talking about a different echelon of player. And as a result, I don't think they should have considered too strongly what's already within their organization. I understand the desire to go out and get a player who could potentially play with a Matvei Michkov long-term. I'm not convinced that Jet Luchenko will be that player. So that was a little tricky for me. And then Gill and Berg, excuse me, I got a bit of a cough. Gill and Berglund, they're good players again, but they were players who I had rated as kind of third or fourth round guys more than second round guys. Berglund's got a lot of work to do on his skating. Protects the puck well, good player, good size, decent skill, but really does have a lot of work to do on his skating stride. Gill, very positive season in the QMJHL. I thought he really, really struggled. He was Canada's worst defenseman at U18 Worlds. I thought he had a really tough time with that level. Skinny kid who needs a lot of growing to do physically, a lot of maturing to do physically. They just felt a little early to me. So as a result, I think they had three really strong picks there that they could have really knocked out of the park, and it just fell a little bit flat for me, even if all three of those guys are good players.
So focusing on Luchenko a little bit, because that is how this, unless one of those guys they took later on really pops, I mean, this draft is going to be remembered as the draft that they passed on Zeev Boyum and took Luchenko. So looking at Luchenko, and you sort of alluded to it, I mean, I was looking at the combine scores from all the prospects, and overall, he was the number one combine scorer at the draft. So you said he's super athletic. It certainly seems like that's the case. Also, I think along with Cole Eiserman, he's one of the youngest players available in the draft. And he was a guy who was playing on a Guelph team that, for my eyes, really was not that good of a team and probably didn't have a lot of capable wingers to put around him during the season. So he was sort of one of those he was a late riser. You mentioned there were a couple teams, I don't know if late riser is the right term, like a Beckett Seneke, but more of like a guy who, like, I guess wasn't super highly thought of before the year started, and then he sort of progressively became more highly thought of. And the Flyers clearly liked him a lot. Like, do you think that there's something to be said that sometimes guys like that don't get enough attention because scouts can kind of be locked into sort of how they're seeing guys at the beginning of the year, and they don't have as much room to move them higher up? Like, I know you talk about him maybe as a middle six center, maybe 2C type of thing. Is there the kind of situation there where you could see him vastly outperforming expectations based on athleticism, his speed, and maybe some underlying strength that wasn't unlocked by his teammates at Guelph?
I think had he been drafted lower, sure, it's going to be very difficult, though. It is very difficult to outperform getting drafted 13th overall. Like, we're talking about a range where you expect a player to be a good player. Even if Jet Luchenko becomes as good as I think he can be, and as good as I'm sure the Flyers think he can be, he's still not likely to vastly exceed where he was picked. He's not likely to be a top 10 guy in a redraft just because he doesn't have that sort of star quality. Now, if he becomes one of the better two-way centers in the league, maybe you're having a different conversation. I think that's what you're hoping for out of Jet Luchenko, with the way he skates, with how strong he is, with how well built he is, with the athleticism, with the attention to detail, his commitment off the puck. That's what you're hoping for. I watched a lot of Jet Luchenko this year. I saw him play 4 or 5 times in Guelph. I saw him play a couple of times on the road with the Guelph Storm. I saw him play at U18 Worlds. I always liked the player. I felt he didn't score enough. That was one of my sort of big criticisms of Jet this year is despite a really sort of good playmaking profile, he only scored about 20 goals in the OHL, despite a strong U18 Worlds when everybody got excited about him, and a strong performance at the CHL Top Prospects game as well. He only actually scored 1 goal at U18 Worlds. So I'd like to see him shoot the puck more and put the puck in the back of the net more. You rarely see guys who score sort of under 30 goals, if you will, drafted in the top 15 in the draft out of the CHL. Now, part of it is what you alluded to. He's one of the younger players in the draft class. He played on a mediocre Guelph Storm team. There are extenuating factors there, but just watching him play, he's not a player who creates a ton of his own looks. He doesn't have that dynamic on-puck quality that an Ivan Demidov or a T.J. Ginla have. He doesn't shoot it like a Cole Eiserman does. Like, he just doesn't have that one really elevating factor outside of maybe the skating. He is one of the better skaters in this age group. But outside of maybe the skating, he doesn't have that game-breaking quality to him. And even the skating doesn't reveal itself in a Connor McDavid type of way. Like he's just a strong, balanced, fast kid. It's not a super, super dynamic skating quality. So I really like Jet. I think he's an excellent player. I expect him to have 90 points next year in the OHL and sort of be one of the better players in the OHL next year. But I just don't view him as a premium skill guy. And as a result, I probably wouldn't have taken him 13th overall.
Okay, fair enough. So let's turn to something that I think you'd be a lot more positive about in terms of the Flyers. You put out one of my most highly anticipated articles of the year is when you put out your list of the top drafted prospects in the NHL.
Yeah,
and
I will have a new list out within this month. So that's.
Do you sleep? Do you ever sleep?
This time of the year, no. It's funny. We joke about vacation at the Athletic and how everybody at the Athletic seems to screw off in August. And of course, in August, I've got the World Junior Summer Showcase and the Hlinka Gretzky Cup. And then when everybody screws off at Christmas time at the Athletic, I also have the World Juniors. So I don't get the typical vacation windows. I'll take a week off once my top 75 drafted prospects list is completed here. I'll take a week off at some point in June or in July here before I head to Plymouth for the World Junior Summer Showcase. But the prospect calendar doesn't have the same breaks that the NHL calendar does. That's for sure.
Well, it really is, greatly appreciated everything you do. It's incredible. Scott also did just a ton of great profiles of various players before the draft that are kind of fun to go back and look at, just in-depth stuff. He did an unbelievable one on Cole Eiserman. I mean, just so many of the top prospects he does that work on. And so back in March, when you released your top drafted prospects, you had a Flyer atop the list, Matvei Michkov, who surprisingly is now coming over 2 years before his KHL contract is over. I think you tweeted out that you were predicting that he could win the Calder Trophy, and was just curious if you could tell the fans a little bit about your thoughts on Matvei, because you've always, to my mind, been higher on him than some of the other prospect guys out there.
Yeah, I mean, Matvei Michkov was ahead of Adam Fantilli and Leo Carlsson on my list in his draft year. He was my number 2 prospect after Connor Bedard. Even if I could understand the case for Fantilli or Carlsson, I wouldn't have let him slip past 4 or 5, for example. I thought getting him at 7 was the best pick of the draft last year, et cetera, et cetera. I think he's so offensively gifted from an execution standpoint. It's funny, he doesn't have that sort of dynamic speed. He doesn't handle the puck and break guys down like an Ivan Demidov or like a Will Smith does with that dynamic one-on-one game. His game is just all about offensive execution. If you give him a look inside the offensive zone, if you give him an extra split second inside the offensive zone to make something happen, he's going to burn you, whether it's with a pass, whether it's with a quick deke, whether it's with a shot. He doesn't maybe go end to end. He doesn't maybe dangle 3 or 4 guys in a sequence. But when there's an offensive play to be made, Matvei Michkov's execution on those plays is as high and as consistent as any player at that age that I've ever watched. So I believe that Michkov is ready to come over and be an impact offensive player, a first-line offensive player, a PP1 guy. He is exactly what the Flyers need. I think we all recognize that you can't compete and win a Stanley Cup if Travis Konecny or Owen Tippett are your best offensive players. They needed to find a star quality player. And I think they have that in Michkov. Now, whether he is that right away or whether there's some growing pains will be TBD. But I think he's going to make an impact right away. I think he's going to be one of their more productive players offensively. I think he could score 60 points next year in the NHL if handled properly. Tortorella is obviously a bit of an X factor there in terms of how that relationship is going to work and how it's going to play out. Matvei is not a committed defensive zone player. One of the criticisms that people had about him throughout his draft year were the number of times when you were watching him on tape and he wasn't in the shot inside the defensive zone kind of thing. He likes to cheat for offense. He likes to hang out in the neutral zone. He's not going to finish a ton of checks. He's not Travis Konecny. Like, he's not that pest. But he is a competitor. Like, he is a competitor in that he wants to make plays. He wants to make a difference. He wants to be a game breaker. He wants to be the best player on the ice offensively. And I think he's going to elevate that group and the ceiling of that group offensively in the top 6 with the Flyers right away. So he's probably the player I'm most looking forward to watching next year, more so than Macklin Celebrini and Lane Hudson and Logan Stankoven. And it's going to be an interesting rookie class. But Michkov, because I haven't seen him live since the World Juniors in Edmonton, I'm very much just looking forward to getting eyes on him and seeing what he looks like. And I think he's got an opportunity to be one of the fun storylines of next year in the NHL.
Yeah, I mean, Flyers fans have not had a whole lot to be super excited about recently. And so the level of anticipation, I mean, the level of excitement when they took him was very exciting. And I think now the level of excitement that he's coming over is just, it's very exciting for Flyers fans. You know, with the Tortorella dynamic, what I've noticed from him is that if you compete hard and you want to win more than anything in the world and you put in the effort, I think Tortorella will like you. And so that's why I'm not as concerned with the Tortorella factor, just because Michkov seems to me like a kid who literally lives at the rink. Like, all he wants to do is play hockey, score goals. His work ethic just seems incredible to me. And so I think they'll have to, Tortorella will get frustrated with him defensively sometimes, but Konecny was sort of a little bit of the same way when Tortorella took over. And those two, to me, it seems like, sort of love each other. And Tortorella will say, like, I don't want Travis to change the way he plays at all. He does things that, I want to, slap him over the helmet sometimes, but also we need guys like that can go out there and change things. And Isaiah, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just want to ask Scott about Michkov and what you observed with his play along the boards. How well he engages. Does he back down from these confrontations? Does he look forward to them? How does he hold his own in that regard?
Well, he's a pretty strong kid, so I'll start there. If you guys see him around the rink at any point or check out a Flyers game, one of the first things you'll notice is that despite the fact that he's sort of 5'10", 5'11", and he's on the smaller side, in terms of stature, he's actually a pretty stocky, strong kid. He's clearly dedicated himself in the gym. He looks stocky. He looks firm. So that helps in those engagements, but it's never going to be a strength of his game. I don't believe he's one of those classic wingers that plays his game actually sort of 3 feet off the boards. He doesn't like to play along the boards. When play is along the boards, you'll see him reaching in and trying to win pucks that way. Now, that doesn't mean he won't compete for pucks. He will. If he feels he can win a puck, he's going to compete to win it. But he's also not going to waste energy hunting pucks and sort of tracking pucks that he doesn't think he can win. He's very methodical in his approach, both offensively and off the puck. But I think it works for him. Like, Along the boards in the offensive zone is not going to be an issue for him because he's so crafty and creative and clever with the puck on his stick that he'll make those quick plays. He'll take a hit to make a play. He wants to create offense. It's really just, I think, his getting back, tracking back, back checking, his defensive habits, committing to winning pucks along the defensive boards. That's going to be his area of growth.
Gotcha. Thanks.
So I wanted to ask you about one other current Flyers prospect who, based on your write-up of the Flyer system, it seemed like you were pretty high on, and also is a guy who I'm guessing you got to see a lot this season because of the team he was playing on, and that's Oliver Bonk, who, put up probably bigger offensive numbers than could be expected this year that we'd see in the NHL based on the fact that he's playing the bumper on the power play. Maybe the Flyers will try to use him like that, but just wanted to get your thoughts on Oliver Bonk, what you see his upside as, what kind of player he is, etc.
Yeah, I mean, obviously an excellent year. He exceeded my expectations. I liked Oliver last year, but he was more of a late 20s guy. Obviously, they took him early 20s. He looks every bit like an early 20s guy now. In hindsight, I was probably 5 or 6 spots too low on him, kind of thing. Oliver's an extremely intelligent player. That's where it starts and ends for Oliver. I've watched a ton of him really over the last year. Watched him a ton in London this season. Watched him at the World Juniors. Watched him. I was in Saginaw for the Memorial Cup and watched him at the Memorial Cup. And he was excellent. He was one of the best players in the OHL. He was one of the top defensemen in the CHL this year. He looked like a stud first round pick. Sorry. I'm still not sure what his ultimate ceiling is. He's a fine skater. It used to be a big issue for him. He's worked hard to get to sort of an average level as a skater. His skill level isn't dynamic. He moves pucks really well and he can handle the puck, and obviously a pretty unique power play role in London, playing the bumper, which is something you never see defensemen do really at any level these days. So they used him there because they felt he was a natural fit. He scored 20 goals in the OHL this year, which is hard to do as a defenseman. There is offense. He's going to make plays and create offense, but it's not the dynamic break you down. He doesn't look like a Lane Hudson, for example. He doesn't look like those sort of highly dynamic offensive defenseman types. And as a result, I wonder what his ceiling is, because he's never, I don't think, going to be an elite defender without the feet. And because he's not sort of 6'4" and can't make up for sort of average skating that way, he relies very much on his reads to play defense. As I mentioned, extremely intellectual player out there. But if he's a number 2 at his ceiling, or is a number 2 for a few years in his career and is a number sort of second pairing guy for the rest of his career, that's still an excellent outcome. If he's a top 4 guy long term, that's a huge outcome for a late first round pick. So, and I think he's going to be that. I'm pretty confident he's going to be a second pairing guy in the NHL. I'm not sure he can be more than that, but he's got the smarts for sure to sort of steer play, to make an impact in all 3 zones. He's a very, very good player, and he's quite likely going to go back and play in London next year and have another chance to win another OHL title and potentially get that elusive Memorial Cup. They're going to have a very, very good team next year, despite the fact that they were a contender in the OHL this year. Denver Barkey will be back. Easton Cowan might be back. Oliver Bonk will be back. Kasper Halttunen will probably be back. Their core of that group will all be back, really, other than McHugh and their goalie Simpson. They're not losing a lot of their sort of core pieces. Jacob Julian, who's a prospect of the Winnipeg Jets, will be back. So there's a lot to like about what that looks like for him next year. He'll obviously get to play on home turf in Ottawa, where he's from, at the World Juniors. He's going to be a huge, huge part of the Canadian World Junior team in Ottawa next year. So there's a lot to look for. I think Denver will probably be a 4th line guy on that Canadian World Junior team as well. So there's a lot to look forward to for those 2 London kids for sure. And oddly enough, they had an opportunity to take a 3rd one. They could have taken Sam O'Reilly at 32nd overall, but they moved that pick, and then Sam O'Reilly gets chosen with that pick by the Edmonton Oilers. So I actually had mocked Sam O'Reilly to them originally there, and it was funny that he still went at that pick.
Yeah, it was and I want to get your thoughts on Denver Barkey in a second, but it's funny. I was talking to Keith Jones earlier this year, and he obviously has the big relationship with Dale Hunter in London, and it's clear that Keith Jones and the Flyers organization love taking kids from the London Knights. They have a lot of respect for what they do there. Keith Jones has a relationship there. I was surprised they didn't take Sam O'Reilly. That'll lead into one question I have. But before we get to that, since we were talking about it, what are your thoughts on Denver Barkey and sort of his NHL potential?
Yeah, Denver's a tricky one to project forward because at the OHL level, at the junior level, he is maybe not an elite player, but one of the top players in his age group at that level, and is also a worker who wins so many pucks and works so hard out there. Engine is always revved up kind of thing. Like he's just got that motor. He gets up and under pucks, and yet I don't think that game will work as effectively for him in the NHL as it does at the junior level because of how small he is. He's not just a short kid. Denver is an extremely underdeveloped kid. He's a very skinny kid, and it's going to be harder, even with his work rate and his stick skill on lifting pucks, it's going to be harder for him to play that sort of classic forechecking, get after it type of player style and be effective doing that against 220-pound defensemen in the NHL. Like it's just you need a different level of strength to play that style of game. Now, he's got time to get in the gym and get stronger, and I know it's a huge priority for him. But I don't know what, frankly, he's going to look like at the NHL level. I think ideally a player with his profile who plays the style that he does, you'd want him to be a third-line energy guy with some secondary skill. He's got some talent. He makes plays, but not a dynamic skill guy. And then because he lacks the size, it's going to be hard for him to play the game that he's played at the OHL level at the NHL level. So I'm cheering for him. Like I'm rooting for him. He's a great kid. I love the way he plays the game. He's the classic sort of Flyers type. The fans will love him. If he does make it, it's going to be, I think he's got more skill than your typical fourth liner. So if he does make it, it'll probably be as a third line guy who can kind of play up and down your lineup, who can penalty kill for you. He was one of the best penalty killers in the OHL this year. Him and Easton Cowan formed this sort of dynamic duo on the PK that created a lot of offense. He can play on the power play. I don't think he'll be more than a PP2 guy, if that. At the NHL level, he's probably more of a 5-on-5 and PK guy at the NHL level who sort of can give you hopefully 40 points. I think that would be what you'd hope for out of a player like Denver Barkey. That's still a very valuable player. Like those guys make $4 million in today's NHL, right? If you're a third line guy who can contribute offensively and penalty kill, you're a very good player in the NHL. But that's kind of what you're hoping for out of Denver, I think. And he's going to need to get a little bit stronger in order to accomplish that.
Okay. That'll be a fun team for Flyers fans to watch next season. And especially if, those two guys hopefully being on the Canadian World Junior team. So the last question I had for you was, and it sort of goes back to the Flyers trading that 31st or 32nd pick where I thought they were going to take Sam O'Reilly, is that they certainly seem to be stockpiling picks for 2025. So right now the Flyers have 3 first-round picks. They have their own first-round pick, which will probably be top 10-ish. They have Colorado's pick and they have Edmonton's pick. Both of those teams probably will be, between 20 to 30, something like that. In the second round, they also have 3 picks, and those picks are their pick, Anaheim's pick, and Columbus's pick. So you could say that they may have 6 picks in the top 40.
Yeah.
Obviously, they got Columbus's pick because Columbus made the decision to use their second round pick this year and deferred their pick to the Flyers next year. And they got the Anaheim second round pick in the Cutter Gauthier trade. I was reading your Corey Pronman, who also worked for The Athletic. I saw he had an article about the 2025 draft yesterday. He said it kind of looked average. I wanted to get your thoughts on how that draft looks to you. And with the Flyers currently, they might trade some of them, but currently having 6 picks in the top 40, potentially, what are your thoughts on that draft? What do you think they'd be looking at?
Well, I think first of all, if they're bad next year, if they take a step back and regress a little bit next year, which I don't think is out of the question for them to do, there are 2, like if you're talking about potentially grabbing a first line center who can play with Matvei Michkov long term, there are 2 players who I believe at this stage have that kind of upside. One is obviously James Hagens, who is the presumptive first overall pick. But the other to keep an eye on is Anton Frundell out of Sweden. Anton is an extreme talent. He's a center. He's got size. He missed the second half of last season due to a surgery and is going to miss, unfortunately, the World Junior Summer Showcase for Sweden, which is about 3 weeks from now in Plymouth. But he is expected to be back for the start of next season. And I wouldn't be surprised if in his draft year he's on the Swedish World Junior team, and not just on the Swedish World Junior team, but maybe a top 6 center for the Swedish World Junior team. So those are sort of the two premium centers to keep an eye on at the top of the draft. There is also Porter Martone, who obviously played shotgun with Gavin McKenna at U18 Worlds this year on Canada's first line. Martone was Canada's captain at this year's U18 Worlds. He's the classic 6'4" power forward, scoring winger. He can skate, great athlete, tons of skill for a 6'3", 6'4" kid. A lot to like about Porter Martone, and he's kind of a scout's dream. So teams are going to be all over him early in the draft. It doesn't have the same depth. Next year's class doesn't have the same depth on D, obviously, that this year's class did. This year was a pretty special group on defense, but there are defensemen at the top of next year's draft who I think are going to go high. Logan Hensler comes to mind, Charlie Trethewey, who is with the United States National Development Program, Matthew Schaefer, who plays with the Erie Otters. There are 4 or 5 legit D in next year's class. Sasha Boumediene is another who will be with Youngstown in the USHL next year. So it's a good group. I would say it's a fine group. It doesn't have Connor Bedard or Connor McDavid, but I believe that James Hagens is going to be a star in the NHL. And then as far as the depth later, I mean, at this stage, it's so early. I'm not going to be able to really speak to what they're looking at with their late firsts and sort of early seconds. But when I did it is noteworthy that when I did put together my very first list for this draft, I wanted it to be this was back in February. I wanted it to be about 20 players, and it ended up being about 25 players after I sat down and watched about 40 guys. So that speaks to the fact that immediately there were more players that I liked than I was expecting to like. So I think there might be some sneaky depth in next year's draft, even if it maybe doesn't have the high end quality of some of the last couple of drafts in particular, but it should be a good group. And I mean, every draft, even in a poor draft, there are good players to be had. And if you're talking about 6 picks in the top 40, the Flyers are quite likely going to get 2 or 3 very good parts of their long-term future there.
Okay.
Gotcha.
Isaiah, did you have anything additional? Or?
No. Answered everything I was wondering about with this past class. And of course, the 25, it seems to be where the Flyers are really putting a lot of their eggs in that basket, no doubt.
Yeah.
What a treat this was, man. Scott's incredible. Like I said, I mean, worth the price of the Athletic by himself. So any hockey fans, I mean, you should be following Scott on Twitter, reading his articles at the Athletic. And I think Flyers fans are going to love this segment.
Yeah, Scott, thanks for doing this. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate that, guys. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
You got it. And we are back for part 2 of our show tonight. Just a reminder about Jim's South Street. They are back at 400 South Street in Philadelphia. 40 years of the best cheesesteaks and hoagies in the grandest Philadelphia tradition. You know you want one. So go down to Jim's South Street, 400 South Street. If you live down near there, of course, you have Uber Eats or DoorDash, whatever it takes to get that delicious food to your door. Jim's South Street, 400 South Street in Philadelphia, PA. And with that, let's bring back the panel. Chef, you're with us for part 2. Say hi.
Hey, guys. How you doing? Glad to make the back half at least.
Yeah. So Dan, welcome back for part 2.
Yeah, absolutely. Great stuff with Scott. And now a lot more great stuff here with us and Chef.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we kind of get to some of the things like the excitement of Matvei Michkov signing his ELC and all, some of the things with that, I just wanted to kind of wrap up the draft from our perspective. We're all fans, 50, 40, 30 plus years between all of us. So I think it's a little bit different. Well, I've watched a lot of drafts from Mark Souzer and some of the disasters to thinking that, Bill Bridgman getting first overall after the Flyers won their second cup and thinking, he's going to be another Guy Lafleur or whatever. We didn't know back then. Now we know almost too much. So with that in mind, with all of us being experts and listening to pundits and talking to Shane Malloy and Russ Cohen and our buddy Steve Cornianos from at The Draft Analyst on X. So somebody's got a phone going there. So, Dan, I'll go to you first. When they made the pick for Lutsenko after they had traded down and already passed on that higher number 12 pick, what was going through your mind?
So, by the way, Chef might be Batman with that phone coming in. It sounded like some kind of like Batman alarm. Are you going to get go and turn up and go save someone or what?
No, it's my diabetes monitor. It just beeped, right, so I had to eat a piece of sugar.
Oh, jeez.
I didn't realize it was that low.
Okay,
so,
I was going to say, what's so important? Yeah, Chef's going to pass out on us here. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I finally get to do the show, and
I went through a string of emotions during the draft. First, there were these heavy rumors they were going to try and trade up for Demidov. So I know they really coveted him. They wanted to add him and have him with Michkov. And so when we got to pick number 5, I was really hoping Montreal was going to take maybe Tizaghinla, because Kevin Weeks on the broadcast was like, watch Tizaghinla here. Because I knew that if Iginla went 5th, then I think the Flyers were going to maybe have a trade in place potentially to Utah for number 6 to take Demidov. So that didn't happen. So that was the first disappointment. Then I knew that the Flyers, the types of defensemen they like are guys like Silyev and Dickinson. And so I had these emotions where I'm like, oh, we're now at pick 10 and neither Silyev or Dickinson have been taken. So the Flyers are probably going to end up with one of these guys. And if they don't end up with one of those two, they'll probably take buyout. So, of course, the frickin' Devils, take Silyev at 10. And then they already have an embarrassment of riches on the blue line. And then at 11, I was convinced San Jose was going to take Zev Buium at 11, and the Flyers were going to get to take Sam Dickinson at 12. Then, of course, San Jose, I guess they wanted size a little bit. They take Dickinson 11. And now it's like, all right, well, hadn't heard anything that the Flyers liked Buium, but he just, Scott Wheeler had him 4th. A lot of people had him as arguably the top defenseman in the draft or top 2. So I'm like, all right, well, this guy's falling into our laps, and he could be the best defenseman on our team, for a long time to come. And then they trade down, and it's like, oh man, what are they doing? And then you hear that the trade is just one pick. They add one pick in the trade. They move down one spot. The Wild take Buium, and they take Lutsenko. So the immediate reaction is, oh, here we go again. It felt like when they passed over Cole Caulfield twice to take Cam York a little bit to me. But then you start doing research and you see that, Lutsenko is an athletic monster. He was the overall best performer at the combines, and he's a great skater, and you have to have faith in these scouts to a certain degree. So now I'm kind of like, all right, well, I'm kind of hopeful that this kid, he's only 17. He's one of the youngest players in the draft. I'm kind of hopeful that he can develop into something really special. And then they trade pick 32 for a first rounder next year. So, okay, now they have 6 picks potentially in the top 40 next year. That's a big deal. So obviously not thrilled with this year's draft. Lutsenko, to me, has a lot of upside. And now we see what happens. We'll get into it probably a little bit more in the show, but I feel like this could be kind of a year where maybe Briere would like to add a high pick. Like maybe the team's not going to be that great. But we'll see. But the draft, it was a disappointment, right? But it's all going to ride on Lutsenko, because it's all going to be, people are going to compare Zev Buium to Jet Lutsenko among the Flyers fan base for a long time to come.
Yeah, and Hellenius too, Chef.
Yeah, I kind of leaning towards Dan. Like I texted, I was like, I can't believe I'm at like an Eric Clapton cover band, tribute band on a Saturday, on a Friday night for the draft. And I'm watching it on my phone because that act isn't even on yet. It's an opening act of some guy. So I'm like, all right. And we get to that. And I'm thinking, oh, well, they're there. They got their pick of who they want. I'm thinking, and then they trade back And I'm like, okay, Boyum's off the board, but now you still got Eiserman, Hellenius, and I'm sitting there going, they're going to get somebody of consequence. And then that's a name I didn't even know. It wasn't a name that popped up in previous shows that we did. So I think a lot of the fans out there felt the same way. We're like, what the heck is this? When all those other sexier names out there and people were talking about other players and kind of like, and we get Jet, and I'm not banging the guy yet. But I said, then you hear the scouting reports on him because we didn't really know much about him. He wasn't on our radar, wasn't on my radar or whatever. And then you feel better. And then you're right. They trade another higher up pick. So you're not looking at anything to impact right away, I guess, because he's still, like you said, young. He's not I think another 2 weeks, he wouldn't have been eligible. If he was born 2 weeks later, he wouldn't even be eligible for this draft. He was late in this year. So in this draft year. So, I mean, right now, I'm very disappointed. I think there was maybe a better option out there. I'm not necessarily going to compare him to Boyum because I don't think that's a comparable thing. But I will compare him to the picks we thought out, definitely Hellenius because he's a center and you'll be able to see what you get. So I'm going to wait and see 2-3 years, see what happens with the other picks that are comparable around them, not defensemen, centermen, and see where we go from there. I'll give them a shot like everybody else, but I'm disappointed. That's all.
Let me tell you what I was thinking of. I remember when we had Steve Cornianos, the draft analyst, on our draft show, our first look. I call it the first look draft show. And I'm trying to think which one was that. And I think it might have been 20. O&B Puckcast episode 221 when we found out they got the 12th pick. And I talked to him about Lutsenko because Craig Button had identified in his first mock Lutsenko as a guy that the Flyers could be interested in. So I remember how he was described by Button as, it sounds like a Scott Lawton kind of player. Opposing players and his teammates all said leader he was, full effort player, condition, great attitude, the whole 9 yards. And I think Steve talked about his speed and all that kind of stuff. And it recalls way back in 2013 when I first heard that the Flyers might be interested in Sam Moran. And wouldn't you know that it was Craig Button that said the Flyers would be interested in Sam Moran. I guess to tie this all together, when they called Jet Lutsenko's name, I thought of whether, and I'm not saying this is fair, I'm not saying it's right or whatever, I thought of Craig Button in 2013, Sam Moran, and the Flyers kind of have overthought this a little bit. And when they passed on Boyum and he got picked, I just could not believe it because, and we talked about earlier with Scott, Boyum was probably better than anybody that the Flyers have in their system or in their NHL team, at least potentially, and could be a number one defenseman, should be a first pairing defenseman. He has no real discernible weaknesses other than he's 6 feet, maybe he's 5'11" and a half, but he's big enough. And he's good defensively. He's everything. He's a great all-around defenseman and potentially a number one. I just was really upset. Hellenius, I understood because there was a lot of North American qualities that Hellenius lacked that Lutsenko had going for him in terms of his conditioning, his attitude, his leadership. And that kind of closes the gap. I still think Hellenius probably has a higher upside. Again, I'm just going by what other pundits have said on our show and what I've read. Chef, you got a comment?
Yeah, I want to ask you, what do you think about the excuse that they gave for Boyum, that he was like on the smaller side and they already had players comparable to that? Did you buy that, or did you just think that, I don't know. To me, it looked like you said they overthought it.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the word Steve Corniano said. They said they overthought that. No, I don't like that. I don't like that because Anaheim had a couple defensemen too many. And that's how they ended up getting Cutter Gauthier, because they had Drysdale, Olins, Zellweger, and Michkov. And they traded from the strength of their team and their system, and it ended up meeting a need. So you can never have too many good defensemen. I mean, between that and centers, you trade from that depth. That's how you build a team. So, and to address your question, I didn't like that. I think you just go with quality no matter what. And I think what they did is they went with filling a need over picking the best player, and probably just went too far with that, Dan.
So one thing I'll mention, because I do agree, Isaiah, that's a way to look at it is, hey, you take Zev Buoyant and you could trade him a year from now and you might be able to get a lot of value. You might be able to trade someone else, right? Like, it seems, I think that they probably have liked Lutsenko all along, but it also feels to me that they sort of, to use a poker term, that they kind of went on tilt after they didn't get Demidov, and then Silyev and Dickinson were scooped up right before them. And they had I don't think they had envisioned a scenario where those guys were gone and Buoyant was available, and they had 5 minutes or 3 minutes to figure it out. I just think they sort of panicked a little bit. They were on tilt. I think they probably could have gotten more for that pick than, just a third round pick to move down. Now, of course, they didn't want to move. Maybe the team in 21st wanted to Zev Buoyant and was offering a lot more, but I think the Flyers did like Lutsenko and they didn't want to miss out on him. And Scott Wheeler and a few other people have said that there were a couple teams in the top 20 that were probably going to take Lutsenko. But here's the other thing I'll mention. And since you mentioned Cutter Gauthier, it's kind of a tie into that. Zev Buoyant is represented by the same agent as Cutter Gauthier. So this couple people brought this up, that it's possible that the Flyers had concerns that, hey, this guy's represented by the same guys as Gauthier. Maybe somehow the Gauthier situation colored that agent against the Flyers a little bit. And maybe that was part of their concern to a certain degree. I don't know if there's any truth to that, but just something else to consider.
Yeah, it's Kurt Overhart is the name of that agent. He runs a KO Sports. I think they got scooped by Dickinson, like Dan was saying. I think Dickinson was like the fallback if they couldn't get Demidov. So if they really wanted to make a splash, if they came home with Dickinson, nobody would be saying anything. And who knows? Maybe they might have traded one of their picks to get a young center. Maybe that's something they still do. I don't know. We'll get to that just a little bit later. But yeah, I think that's what caught him off guard, like you were saying, on tilt just a few minutes ago. And there's more to that point, because you remember right before they made that pick, they were on the phone and they were trying to make a deal. And it seems like the Flyers went over their allotted period of time when they're at number 12, and they finally made that trade. So, Chef, you got something to say?
I think it's just a classic example of not taking best player available anymore. I mean, like you said, that it doesn't matter if you keep them or not, or you keep it. It's just a classic. It's a classic example. You could trade it. It's not necessarily the person that you can use or not use. It's currency, man. And when you're building, that currency, sometimes is very, very valuable in other assets, not just the player. Yeah.
Well, and if you want to talk about one other pick before we move on to Flyers business, there was a guy kind of caught my attention, and he's a good story. And Noah Powell was a 5th round pick. He's an overager from what I remember. And he has a hearing disability. I don't know if he's technically deaf, but he needs to wear hearing aids. So I guess, there's legally blind, maybe there's legally deaf. I don't know. I don't want to sound ignorant. I think it's too late. I already do. But he scored 43 goals in his league. Is it USHL, I believe? And one of the things I like about him, and that is a positive that may translate at a pro level, is that he plays in front of the net. He plays a very strong net front game. He's a good shooter. And Dan, maybe you could fill in a little bit more. I mean, if there's maybe a sleeper here and who had to get through some of his issues in terms of communication, maybe Noah Powell's that one player in this draft that could sneak up on other teams that maybe should have been drafted higher.
Yeah, and look, I'm not going to pretend to know much, if anything, about the other guys that the Flyers have drafted. I haven't done a lot of research on those guys, so I'm not going to pretend that I have the knowledge. But just from reading about him, it seems like a great story, like you said. He is an overager. He put up really good numbers this year. I think he was one of the leading scorers in the USHL.
Yeah, he had 43 goals.
Yeah, and I'm always a little skeptical of overagers. I've always been skeptical of Ronnie Adder due to that reason, and really any guys who are kind of in that boat. But I think the hope is that, a few of the guys that the Flyers drafted in rounds 2 and up, and they traded up to take a few of those guys, will pan out. It seems like the Flyers really focused on taking size after they took Lachenko, who's kind of a smaller player. But the overarching thread running through the rest of their draft after Lachenko was basically they took guys with size. So we'll see how it turns out.
Yeah, I hope that I don't know. I just don't have a great feeling about this draft. And like Jackie Spiegel from the Inquirer, in the first line of her article about the draft, and I'm quoting here, let's cut straight to it. Speaking to several insiders, the consensus is the Flyers 2024 draft was pretty underwhelming. And you know what? These people could be a bunch of horses' asses in 5 years. Who knows? But if you want to, if as someone who's followed all these drafts for all these years, that's kind of like the feeling that I was left with. I hope Lachenko makes it. And there's some reasons to believe that he's got a real high floor. At the very least, should be a third line center. I was hoping for a little more. And you know what? If he's another kind of sort of version of Mike Richards, well, maybe a little more speed and better conditioning, hey, I'll take that. He doesn't shoot like Mike, but I'm just trying to give people hope. But anyway, let's get to some really good news. Matvei Michkov, Dan, he's here. He signs his ELC, and they've maxed out his bonus schedule. So he stands to make a lot of money if he hits certain numbers. And I think that was part of the calculation in getting him over here.
Yeah, and we heard earlier from Scott Wheeler. He was Scott Wheeler's #1 NHL prospect back in March. I've always thought of him as close to the same level as a Connor Bedard. The last time that Bedard and Michkov were on the same ice together when they were 16 years old, Michkov actually outperformed him from a statistical perspective. And I think that the fact that he's been in Russia sort of led to him being undervalued. Now he's here after 1 year. We thought it might be 3 years. I think that him and Torts, that's going to be one of the questions, him and Torts, I think they're going to get along fine. Torts respects guys that have a good work ethic and love hockey. And Michkov, man, he lives, eats, and breathes hockey. I don't know if he ever leaves the rink. And even in the press conference that Danny Briere did, I think even Briere, and they want to be conservative with some of the things that they say, but he basically said, like, we're immediately expecting him to help the power play, our #1 power play unit. He said that, it's going to be up to Torts in terms of his ice time 5-on-5 and that kind of thing. But I just thought it was interesting that Briere was basically like, this guy's going to be on our top power play and he's going to be, hopefully making a big difference. They're clearly extremely excited about him. Scott Wheeler said he thinks that he would be the favorite for the Calder Trophy in his mind as Rookie of the Year. I think that it's just extremely exciting that this kid has made it over here. Well, he's not here yet, but they're saying he'll probably be here, in advance of training camp. He signed his 3-year ELC. It's just great. I think it's going to give people something really exciting to watch this year for the Flyers. I can't wait to see him play. I can't wait for that home opener. I'll be there. I can't wait.
Yeah, schedule's out, and they start on the road, I believe. I didn't get a quick look at it. Yeah, Chef, I wanted you to weigh on Matvei.
Yeah, Mitch, he's been playing with, men too this last season. It wasn't like he was juniors or anything. He's playing in KHL. It's no joke. That will give him an advantage this year. I think, like we said before, do not for any reason think that this guy's going to put up 60, 70 points this year. Be happy, I think we said, with between 40 and 50. But if he does get that, I mean, that's great. I think he's got a lot going for him. I think, we put a lot of hope into him. We just got to stave like our expectations about what's going to happen this year.
Well, he'll go through a learning process. I do believe Scott talked about him this morning as someone who could put up 60 points, but I think that's probably the ceiling going through the process of learning how to check and working along the boards, which I think is something that's going to be a bare minimum for Tortorella. But we'll see. I look forward to having him here. It's going to be Michkov Mania. The sweaters are going to fly off the shelves. They have T-shirts, they have everything. Before you know it, they'll have baseball shirts, everything with Michkov, number 39. But we know, as exciting as that is, I know we're all equally excited that for 1 year and $1 million, Erik Johnson's coming back. And Chef, why don't you comment on EJ coming back, because he's good in the room and he's going to play the Mark Stahl role. And I'm about as excited with that as I am about anything.
Yeah, I mean, like they made some other moves, but like I mean, it's okay. Like I said, I've said this in the past. Never underestimate, and I mean the good locker room guys. They're the ones that are going to make the difference in the team. You don't want to mess with the locker room too much with these guys, because they do actually matter. People just think you can just put a whole bunch of talented guys together and it's a team, and that's not always the case. We've seen that over years. You've seen guys go out in the first round. I think they're continuing to add pieces through the years now. They're going to add it. I guess you're going to talk about Hathaway's extension too, so you might as well just throw that in there.
Yeah, he's one of those guys. But before we do that, just to mention that they bought out Cam Atkinson. It's going to cost them $2.358 million this year and $1.758 next year. I think it was the right way to go, because Cam didn't want to. Cam's in the last year of his contract, and his career is almost over. So today he gets picked up by Tampa on a 1-year deal for $900,000. Cam Atkinson's one of the really good guys in hockey, and yeah, he's another good leadership by example kind of player, and I'm glad to hear that. But Hathaway, Dan, what is the rush to go out and extend Garnet Hathaway, knowing, of course, that he was everything that they wanted him to be last year, but he was going to be a free agent going toward this season, and a season where they're collecting all these assets for 2025, he would have been a prime candidate to be traded at the deadline if they're as committed to this rebuild. But they're saying, no, we want this guy here. He's not making a ton of more money. I think it was 2.7. It was a raise. I have that.
Was it 2.375, and now he's going to be at 2.4 or like 2.7?
2.4. Yeah, 2.4 now. Yeah.
So I think he's one of those guys who they really, really think was a huge culture changer for this team, and someone that a lot of the young kids respect. He's a much better hockey player than Nicolas Deslauriers. So I don't have a huge issue with it. I think that he's a guy that they view as someone who's kind of like a safe signing. I don't know. It's they clearly are not going to do a lot this offseason. And now you've got kind of a glut. You've got a glut of kind of the same type of guys to a certain degree. With now Deslauriers is still here for 2 more seasons. Now Hathaway's here for 3 more seasons. Lawton's here for 2 more seasons unless they trade him. Ryan Poehling is signed for 2 more seasons. These guys are somewhat similar. Noah Cates brings a lot of the similar things to the table as those guys. I mean, you're getting to a point where now you've almost got your entire bottom 2 lines. If you're looking at who's signed here, and you've got Deslauriers, Lawton, Hathaway, Poehling, Cates. Like, these are all guys who are not very exciting. And then signing Erik Johnson, who I think they view almost the same way that they did with Stahl last year, as sort of like a player coach to a certain degree. I think they may have the year this coming year that some of us were expecting them to have this year, and they kind of outperformed expectations. Of course, I think Michkov is going to make things a lot more exciting, but I have real concerns about what's going to happen to Sean Couturier's game. And he was really good the first half of the season. So, I think there are some concerns. It doesn't seem like they're going to do a whole lot this offseason. Maybe Briere is lying to everybody about that. But, right now, not getting the sense that we're going to see a whole lot of movement, which is fine because really a lot of the money comes off next year, right? Well, I guess Hayes is still 2 more seasons of the buyout of the retained salary, and now Atkinson's going to be on the books for another 2 years. But D'Angelo comes off the books next year. Johansson is going to come off the books next year. Cal Peterson is going to come off the books next year. So, that's 10 million that's coming off. That's kind of dead money. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm not expecting a lot this offseason.
Yeah, you think about it. Senators re-signed Shane Pinto to a 2-year, $7.5 million contract. He's always been in the rumor mill. The one thing Danny said in his presser when he was talking about Michkov primarily, but what the team is going to do, he said that really after like this next week, and there were a couple trades today, some players. Radek Fox got traded. I think finally Ottawa cleared out Matthew Joseph's deal to help pay Shane Pinto. Although Ottawa still has some cap room, if I remember correctly. Buffalo has like $19 million in cap space. They might have to pay some people. There are some teams that look like they still want to improve. And the rationale in my mind is, free agency, they spent over $1 billion. And now teams are trying to, there are losers in this free agency period. There's losers the day after, and then there's real losers a year later, right? So, and when we look back, that's always the case. I think with what the Flyers have, they certainly have assets to move players out. And if they're committed to getting more young pieces here, I think it's still a possibility. I'm not as optimistic as I was at the end of yesterday, but we'll see. There's still some activity and some teams that have some cap space that may want to do some things and or good trade matches for the Flyers. I mean, Calgary is a team that could still want to do things, and Buffalo, and possibly, like I said, Ottawa. And, just looking at Puckpedia now that Cap Friendly is not really is now owned by the Capitals. So goodbye, Cap Friendly. So, I mean, yeah, go ahead.
Well, okay. There is other teams, but don't discount a hockey trade and don't discount a 3-team trade.
Well, that's what the 3-team at this point. There's a 3-team at this point. I don't know. It's very complicated. I mean, anything's possible. Yeah, it would be a hockey trade. I don't think the Flyers are going to take on. They can't take on salary. No, I'm talking about if somebody wants more leaders, because there is an overlap, like Dan was saying, of all these guys that are like assistant coaches in the room and all that. There is a lot of overlap, and like, when are they going to finally part ways with Scott Lawton, knowing that a number 1 pick was out there? I don't even know if a number 1 pick is out there any longer for that player. And he's only $3 million on the cap. It's like, it's crazy. He's not as attractive to us as he may be with a team that has more talent, that just can't find a way, doesn't know how to win, doesn't know how to hold a locker room together, and they lose their when things go wrong, like in Buffalo or Ottawa. They just can't break through.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you there, but I think he's going to surprise us one more time. I think there's something out there and like I said, we'll only know about it if they want us to know about it. Every time they want us to know about something, we hear about it, and if we don't, it's just like a sneak attack, a Briere attack or whatever. And he sneaks one in, he sneaks Michkov in, Quitter Gauthier out. So I just think if they want us to know, we'll know, but I wouldn't surprise me if he pulls off one more sneaky little move.
I'm hoping so. I think the Flyers still need to stock the cupboard after coming off this draft with some young talent. That's what they're looking for. Either whether it's another pick or and you can't get to a point you have too many picks, and they might be strategizing to get up. They might have been willing to make certain moves to move up to get Demidov, but they didn't actually have enough assets. And maybe they need to stockpile yet more picks. I think they're going to have at least one more first-round draft pick going into next year, unless, of course, they trade one of those picks for a young player. And we'll have to see. Because I think they're definitely committed to getting centers, and next year is a really good time to do that. So they're having the development camp this week. They came in today, and it runs through Saturday at 6 p.m. ends with a scrimmage. I'm sure they're going to hit the beach, like the trial on the aisle. It's still doing that, I believe. So that's I never really thought that was any big deal. Anybody want to say congratulations to the Florida Panthers for winning the Cup when we thought they were down and out after 3 straight losses?
I was very happy. I have a lot of friends and family that live in the Florida area, so they were very happy. They deserved it.
One more topic. With what's happened with 2025, and it's obvious the Flyers are trying to gather a lot of assets and making whatever moves. If they're going to make a big move, it seems like it's going to be at the draft, around the draft, whatever, for 2025. Does this put a different light on signing Travis Konecny, that it seems like they're kicking the can further down the road, maybe a year or so? And yet it seems like they're as determined as ever to sign him, and it makes less sense the more I think about it. Dan, let me get you to weigh in on that.
Yeah, the Konecny thing is going to be very interesting because Michkov is a right winger. Konecny is a right winger. Like, these guys are not going to be moving off their respective positions. How much do you really want to pay your second line right winger? Because ultimately Konecny is going to be that. He's been great in the room. He was great on the ice. He's been our best player. But like you said, I mean, you look at the contracts out there. Sam Reinhart, I know he got the Florida discount that he took, but he's, between 7 to 8 million. And who's the other player that also kind of like
Buchnevich just got paid?
Yeah, well, there was another guy other than Reinhart who was between 7 to 8 million, who clearly is a better player than Konecny, or at least a better scorer. I'm blanking on it, but it was like, hold on, now I want to see who I was thinking of.
Oh yeah, yes. Just yesterday.
But basically, like, there were people talking about how he was going to be making, he would want to make 9 million a year. With some of the contracts that have been given out under 8 million, it's hard for me to believe that his agent has a leg to stand on with that. And then you look at the fact that if you re-sign him to a long-term contract, you're tying up a lot of money in a guy who might not be at his top level when you're now sort of kicking the can down the road a little bit with all the picks they have for next year. So I won't be surprised if they end up moving Konecny this offseason. That could be the kind of like the surprise thing that I could see. But I think it might have been more of something during the draft, potentially, that now sort of like the ship has sort of sailed on. So,
I mean, Danny sounds like it's like they're looking forward to signing him. And
oh yeah, what did Jake Gensel sign for?
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, Gensel. I thought it was like for a 30-year-old. What is Tampa doing? They bring in McDonough, and they trade Sergachev, and they sign Gensel and Stamkos. Are Sergachev and Stamkos, is that an upgrade? Is that like, are Gensel and McDonough an upgrade from that? But yeah, let me just get Gensel.
Gensel signed for 7 years, 63 million. So what is that, like 8.5 million a year, if my math is correct? And Reinhart signed for 8.5 million. So those are both guys who outperformed Konecny. So you certainly wouldn't think he's going to get any more than that, even though they've got kind of like the weird Florida tax situation. But I think the Konecny thing is definitely going to bear watching.
Yeah, Gensel's 9 million for 7.
Yeah, I don't think that you're going to find out it's not going to be that much. I think it's going to be right around 8 to 8.25, somewhere in there. I don't think so. I think that's where it's going to end up being. And I'll say this. Well, you got to start somewhere. Unless if you're doing you have Michkov this year, and you have to start somewhere. Do you want to start over? Because the players, let's just say we keep 4 out of the top 40 picks next year, and we trade away 2 other picks, and we get some decent players out of that. They're 3 years away too. So now we burning 4 years of Michkov, 4 or 5 years of Michkov before we do anything. Do you want to start from a higher ground and open up like spots on the roster that you were talking about earlier? I'm not saying, Konecny's great. I'm just saying in 3 years, that's probably going to be the going rate for a second line winger.
I don't know. It's hard to say. I mean, he brings a lot of extra, the intangibles. His work on the penalty kill has a lot of teams concerned about him. He's a weapon like that. It hasn't translated on the power play, though. So it's like it's going to be. It kind of makes up for what's not happening on the power play. And of course, Michkov is going to get his spot on the power play. That's the thing that's disappointing. You're going to pay a guy like $8.5, maybe even as much as $9 million, last in the league 3 years in a row. And he's not helping that out. So that's part of it too. I love the fact that, he's good on the other side of the specialty teams, but with the timeline and everything, my vote is they probably should have moved on from Travis this draft and gotten a young center or a young defenseman. And that's what I would have done. But
I agree with you.
We'll see what happens. So,
yeah.
Okay, listen, we're going to leave it right there. Let's just remind everybody that you can catch the O&B Puckcast on X at O&B Puck, at O&B Puck, on Getter, at O&B Puckcast, at O&B Puckcast. You can catch us on a multitude of podcast platforms: Apple, Spotify, iHeart, TuneIn, Amazon Audible, Deezer. We have a YouTube page. Just plug in there, O&B Puckcast. And, of course, a Facebook page as well. So check us out. We really appreciate it. And if you do, rate and subscribe. If you subscribe, follow, whatever applies, it helps us out when the algorithm is searching for Philadelphia Flyer podcast, which, of course, is what we are. Final word for the night. Dan, you want to go first?
Final word. Well, I don't know. This has been a fun show. I think it's the final word has to be Michkov, because that's what it's all going to be about. I got an email within minutes of them announcing his signing for my season ticket rep. Everyone's going wild about Michkov. Let us know if you want to upgrade your seating position. And I mean, they're just going to milk this for everything that it's worth. And I think it's great. It's going to cause some excitement. So it's really all going to be about Michkov.
Fantastic. And people can catch you on X at dsilver88.
You got it.
You got it. Chef, what's the word?
Well, I guess everything is fun in hockey again in Philly. We labored through the other stuff. Now we have hope. And, we thought we had hope, and we thought hope was 3-4 years away, but now hope is 3-4 months away. So that's a good thing. So this is awesome. So, yeah, you can, I say some pretty wild stuff and have some crazy hockey conspiracy theories. So, and trades and stuff like that. You could argue with me about that on X or Twitter or whatever you're calling it now, at Chef to the Left B on Twitter.
Fantastic. So we're going to call it a show. If the Flyers make any moves or anything of substance, we'll be back to talk about that. Other than that, we'll probably take a little bit of like a 2 or maybe even a 3-week hiatus. At some point, we're going to have Steve Cornianos, the draft analyst, back to assess the Flyers' entire prospect pool. Who knows? We've got some other surprises in store for you. So until next time, everybody, thanks for listening and take care.